The world had been silent for 63 days. Eleanor Grayson, at 72, had grown accustomed to the muffled void that her sudden hearing loss had thrust upon her. It began one crisp October morning, a faint hum in her ears that grew into a suffocating stillness by nightfall. Doctors called it idiopathic sensorineural hearing loss, a fancy term for we don't know why. They prescribed steroids, adjusted her hearing aids, and told her to wait. It might come back, they said, their voices already fading into the haze of her memory. For 2 months, Eleanor lived in a cocoon of silence. Her only companions the vibrations of footsteps on her old oak floors and the flickering images of muted television shows. Her home in Willow Creek, a small town nestled in the rolling hills of upstate New York, had always been her sanctuary. The 2-story Victorian, with its creaking staircase and wraparound porch, held decades of memories, laughter with her late husband, George, and the chaotic joy of raising their only child, Michael. But now, the house felt like a museum of her past, its quietness amplifying her isolation. She communicated through scribbled notes and exaggerated gestures, her once sharp wit dulled by the effort it took to connect with the world. Eleanor's days followed a predictable rhythm. Mornings were spent tending her garden, her fingers sinking into the cool earth as she planted tulip bulbs for spring. Afternoons were for reading, her eyes tracing the words of Jane Austen novels she'd loved since girlhood. Evenings brought visits from Michael, now 38, who'd moved back to Willow Creek after a messy divorce. He'd stop by with groceries, his smile warm but fleeting, his eyes always darting to his phone. Eleanor cherished these visits, though she sensed a distance in him, a restlessness she couldn't place. On the 64th day, everything changed. Eleanor woke to a faint chirping outside her window. At first, she thought it was a trick of her mind, a cruel echo of memory. But the sound grew sharper, a sparrow, insistent and clear. She sat up, heart pounding, and reached for her hearing aid on the nightstand. As she adjusted it, the world rushed back, the creak of her bed frame, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the soft rustle of leaves outside. Tears welled in her eyes. She could hear again. Eleanor spent the morning testing her rediscovered sense. She played Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata on her old record player, letting the notes wash over her like a long-lost friend. She called her neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, just to hear her raspy voice complain about the weather. The joy was overwhelming, but it came with a strange unease. The world sounded different now, sharper, almost intrusive. She noticed things she hadn't before, the way the floorboards groaned under Michael's heavy steps, the faint jingle of his keys as he paced her living room during his visits. That evening, Michael arrived earlier than usual, his coat dusted with snow. Eleanor greeted him with a beaming smile, eager to share her miracle. "Michael, I can hear again," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with excitement. She expected him to laugh, to hug her, to share in her joy. But his smile was tight, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't read. "That's great, Mom," he said, his voice flat. "Really great." He stayed for dinner, as he often did, but the conversation felt stilted. Eleanor tried to draw him out, asking about his job at the local hardware store, his plans for the future. He answered in short bursts, his attention drifting. After dessert, he offered to take out the trash, a small gesture that warmed her heart. She watched him step outside, the back door creaking shut behind him. That's when she heard it, a low murmur from the porch, just beyond the kitchen window. Curious, Eleanor moved closer, her hearing aid amplifying the sound. It was Michael's voice, hushed but unmistakable. "Yeah, it's all set," he said, The lawyer says the will's airtight, but we can work around it. She's got no idea. A pause. Then a chuckle. 2 months of silence. And now this. Perfect timing. Eleanor froze, her hand gripping the counter. Her son's words cut through her like a blade. The will. Her inheritance. The estate she and George had built over decades' savings. Investments. The house itself was meant for Michael, but only after her passing. Was he planning to take it now? Her mind raced, replaying his recent behavior, the frequent visits, the questions about her finances, the way he'd linger near her desk where she kept her important papers. She stepped back, her breath shallow, the joy of her restored hearing twisted into something bitter. She wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but fear held her back. What if she'd misunderstood? What if this was just a cruel coincidence? She sank into a chair, the weight of betrayal settling in her chest. The house, once a haven, now felt like a trap. As Michael returned, wiping snow from his boots, Eleanor forced a smile. "Everything okay, Mom?" he asked, his tone casual. She nodded, her throat tight. "Just tired," she said. He didn't press, and soon he was gone, leaving her alone with the echo of his words. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat by the fireplace, the crackle of the logs a stark reminder of her newfound clarity. She thought of George, his gentle laugh, his unwavering trust in their son. Had she failed as a mother? Had she missed the signs of Michael's discontent? The questions gnawed at her, but one thing was certain: she couldn't ignore what she'd heard. Tomorrow, she would start searching for answers quietly, carefully. She would protect what was hers, not out of greed, but out of principle. This was her life's work, her legacy, and no one, not even her son, would take it from her. Eleanor woke with a resolve she hadn't felt in years. The shock of Michael's words lingered, but she refused to let it paralyze her. She was no stranger to hardship. Widowed at 55, she'd rebuilt her life alone, managing finances, maintaining the house, and keeping her spirit intact. If Michael was scheming, she would uncover the truth. But she would do it her way, methodically, discreetly, with the wisdom of her years. The morning was crisp, the air heavy with the promise of more snow. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, a notebook open before her. She began jotting down everything she remembered from the previous night, Michael's exact words, the tone of his voice, the pause that followed his chuckle. She tried to recall his behavior over the past 2 months, his frequent visits, his questions about her health, her savings, the house. At the time, she'd thought he was being attentive, a son stepping up for his aging mother. Now, each memory felt tainted. Her first step was to secure her assets. Eleanor had always been meticulous about her finances. After George's death, she'd learned to navigate bank accounts, investments, and legal documents. The will, drafted a decade ago, left everything to Michael, with a small portion set aside for local charities. But she hadn't updated it in years, and Michael's words suggested he knew its details. How? She hadn't shared it with him. The thought sent a chill through her. She drove to the bank, her old sedan crunching over the icy roads. The manager, Mr. Thompson, greeted her warmly. "Mrs. Grayson, good to see you. Heard you got your hearing back. Miracle, isn't it?" Eleanor smiled, masking her unease. She requested a review of her accounts and any recent activity. Thompson pulled up her records, his brow furrowing. "There's an inquiry from last week," he said. "Someone called about your savings account. Said they were your son, checking on your behalf." Eleanor's heart sank. "Did you give him any information?" she asked, her voice steady despite the panic rising within her. Thompson shook his head. "No, ma'am. We require in-person verification for that." She thanked him, her mind racing. Michael had been probing, testing the waters. But why? He had a job, a small apartment. Was he in debt? Desperate? Or simply greedy? Back home, Eleanor called her lawyer, Margaret Wells, a sharp woman in her 50s who'd handled George's estate. Margaret agreed to meet the next day to review the will and discuss safeguards. "You sound worried, Eleanor," Margaret said, her tone gentle but probing. Eleanor hesitated. "Just cautious," she replied. She wasn't ready to accuse her son, not yet. That afternoon, Eleanor searched the house for clues. She started in her study, where she kept her financial records in a locked drawer. The key, hidden in a tin box under her bed, was still there. But as she opened the drawer, she noticed something off. The folder containing her will was slightly askew, its edges bent as if it had been handled recently. Her pulse quickened. She hadn't touched it in months. She spent the evening poring over the document, her hearing aid amplifying the soft rustle of pages. Everything was as she read, no changes, no forgeries. But the realization that Michael might have seen it, might have studied it, made her feel exposed. She locked the folder in a small safe she'd bought years ago, resolving to move it to a safety deposit box. Michael called that night, his voice cheerful through the phone. "Hey, Mom. Just checking in. You feeling okay?" Eleanor gripped the receiver, her mind torn between love and suspicion. "I'm fine," she said, forcing warmth into her tone. "Just enjoying the quiet." He laughed, but it sounded hollow. After hanging up, she sat in the dark, the weight of her discovery pressing down on her. The next day, Margaret arrived at the house, her briefcase stuffed with legal pads and files. Over tea, Eleanor shared her concerns, omitting the overheard conversation but focusing on Michael's recent behavior. Margaret listened intently, her pen tapping against her notepad. "We can add protections," she said. "A trust, for instance, to control how and when your assets are distributed. It's not uncommon for people your age to take these steps." Eleanor nodded, relief mingling with guilt. Was she betraying Michael by doubting him? Or was she protecting herself from a betrayal far worse? Margaret promised to draft the trust documents within a week. As she left, she squeezed Eleanor's hand. "You're doing the right thing," she said. Eleanor wanted to believe her. That night, Eleanor dreamed of George. He was young again, his hair dark, his smile wide as he spun her around their old living room. "Trust your heart, Ellie," he said, his voice clear as the day they met. She woke with tears in her eyes, the dream lingering like a warning. She loved Michael, but she couldn't ignore the truth. Tomorrow, she would dig deeper into his life, his motives, his secrets. She would find out what had turned her son into a stranger. Eleanor's investigation began in earnest. She started with small, subtle steps, unwilling to confront Michael directly until she had more evidence. Her love for him warred with her growing distrust, creating a knot of tension that tightened with each passing day. She decided to visit the hardware store where Michael worked, hoping to glean insight from his co-workers or environment. The store, a sprawling warehouse on the edge of Willow Creek, smelled of sawdust and metal. Eleanor wandered the aisles, pretending to browse for gardening tools. She spotted Michael near the paint section, restocking cans with a practiced efficiency. He hadn't noticed her yet, and she took the opportunity to observe him. His shoulders were tense, his movements quick, almost agitated. A coworker, a young man with a scruffy beard, clapped Michael on the back, and they exchanged a few words. Eleanor strained to hear, her hearing aid picking up fragments. Deal's still on. Don't worry. He's good for it. Her stomach churned. Was this related to the phone call she'd overheard? She approached Michael, forcing a smile. Thought I'd surprise you, she said, holding up a pair of pruning shears. His eyes widened, but he recovered quickly, flashing a grin. Mom, what are you doing here? He steered her toward the checkout, his arm around her shoulders a little too tightly. They chatted briefly, but he seemed eager to get her out of the store. As she left, she glanced back and saw him whispering to the bearded coworker, their heads bent close. Back home, Eleanor added the interaction to her notebook, her handwriting shaky. She needed to know more about Michael's life as friends, his habits, his finances. She remembered he'd mentioned a friend named Greg, someone he'd met during his divorce. Greg had visited the house once, a charming man in his 40s with a salesman's smile. Eleanor hadn't thought much of him at the time, but now she wondered if he was the he Michael had mentioned at the store. She called Mrs. Callahan, her nosy but well-meaning neighbor, under the pretense of borrowing sugar. Over coffee, Eleanor steered the conversation toward Michael. He's been spending a lot of time with that Greg fellow, Mrs. Callahan said, her eyes gleaming with gossip. Saw them at the diner last week, talking all hush-hush. Greg's got a fancy car, too fancy for Willow Creek, if you ask me. Eleanor nodded, her mind racing. A fancy car suggested money, or debt, or both. Was Greg pulling Michael into something shady? That evening, Eleanor did something she never thought she'd do. She searched Michael's old bedroom. He'd lived there briefly after his divorce, and though he'd moved out, he still kept some belongings in the closet. She felt a pang of guilt as she rifled through boxes, but her need for answers outweighed her unease. She found old bank statements, a few unpaid bills, and a crumpled receipt from a lawyer's office dated a month ago. The lawyer's name wasn't Margaret's. Eleanor's heart sank. Michael had been consulting someone else. She spent the next day tracking down the lawyer, a man named Victor Langston, whose office was in a neighboring town. Posing as a potential client, Eleanor called and asked about estate planning. Langston was cagey but confirmed he handled sensitive family matters. When she mentioned Michael's name casually, he paused before saying, "I don't discuss clients." It was enough to confirm her suspicions. Eleanor's fear grew, but so did her determination. She began tailing Michael discreetly, borrowing Mrs. Callahan's car to avoid recognition. She followed him to a bar on the outskirts of town, where he met Greg. The two sat in a corner booth, their conversation animated but too quiet for her to hear from her spot near the entrance. Greg slid a folder across the table, and Michael nodded, his expression grim. Eleanor left before they could spot her, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. At home, she pored over her notes, piecing together a timeline. Michael's divorce had left him financially strained. She knew that much. He'd mentioned debts, but never specifics. Had he turned to Greg for help? Was Greg manipulating him? Or was Michael the mastermind, driven by resentment or desperation? The questions swirled, each one a blow to her trust in her son. That night, Michael stopped by unannounced. Eleanor was in the kitchen, her notebook hidden under a pile of magazines. He seemed on edge, his eyes scanning the room. "You've been acting strange, Mom," he said, his tone half teasing, half accusing. "Everything okay?" Eleanor's heart raced, but she kept her voice calm. "Just adjusting to the hearing again," she said. It's Overwhelming. He nodded, but his gaze lingered, as if searching for something. As he left, Eleanor made a decision. She couldn't keep playing detective alone. Tomorrow, she'd confront Michael not with accusations, but with questions. She'd give him a chance to explain, to prove her wrong. But deep down, she feared the truth would break her heart. Eleanor spent the morning preparing for the confrontation. She wanted to approach Michael with care, to avoid pushing him away. She chose the living room, where they'd shared so many memories Christmas mornings. Late-night talks, George teaching Michael to play chess. The familiarity might ease the tension. She rehearsed her words, aiming for a balance of firmness and compassion. She didn't want to accuse him outright. She wanted him to open up, to trust her with the truth. Michael arrived at noon, carrying a bag of groceries as usual. Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Michael, we need to talk," she said as he set the bag on the counter. His shoulders stiffened, but he nodded, joining her on the couch. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken questions. "I've noticed you've been different lately," she began, her voice steady, more secretive. "I'm worried about you. Are you in trouble? Is there something you're not telling me?" Michael's eyes flicked to hers, then away. "I'm fine, Mom," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. Eleanor pressed on. "I heard you on the phone the other night, talking about the will." "My will?" Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Michael's face paled. For a moment, he said nothing, his fingers drumming against his knee. Then he laughed, a forced, brittle sound. "You must have misheard. I wasn't talking about your will." Eleanor's heart sank. She'd hoped for honesty, but his denial felt like another betrayal. "Michael," she said softly, "I know what I heard. Please, tell me what's going on." He stood abruptly, pacing the room. "You're jumping to conclusions, Mom. I'm not plotting anything. I was talking about work stuff. A deal at the store." His words were rushed, his eyes avoiding hers. Eleanor wanted to believe him, but the pieces didn't fit. The lawyer, the folder at the bar, the whispers at the store, they pointed to something darker. "Michael, I found a receipt from Victor Langston's office," she said, her voice trembling. "Why were you seeing a lawyer behind my back?" His pacing stopped, and he turned to face her, his expression a mix of anger and panic. "You've been snooping," he snapped. "What? You don't trust me now?" The accusation stung, but Eleanor held her ground. "I want to trust you," she said, "but you're making it hard." The argument escalated, voices rising despite Eleanor's efforts to stay calm. Michael accused her of paranoia, of twisting his words. She countered with the evidence she'd gathered, each revelation widening the rift between them. Finally, he threw up his hands. "Fine, Mom. You want the truth. I'm in debt. Bad debt. After the divorce, I got in over my head credit cards. Loans. All of it. I didn't want to worry you." Eleanor's anger softened, replaced by a wave of pity. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "I could have helped." Michael shook his head. "I didn't want your money. I wanted to fix it myself. Greg." He offered a way out. "A business deal. But it's complicated." He wouldn't meet her eyes, and Eleanor sensed he was holding back. She pressed for details, but Michael clammed up, promising to explain later. He left abruptly, leaving Eleanor with more questions than answers. Was the debt the whole story? Or was there more to his plan? She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still hiding something. That afternoon, Eleanor called Margaret again, updating her on the confrontation. Margaret suggested hiring a private investigator to look into Michael's finances and Greg's background. Eleanor hesitated. Spying on her son felt like a line she couldn't uncross. But the stakes were too high. She agreed, giving Margaret the go-ahead to hire someone discreet. The investigator, a gruff man named Paul Carter, met Eleanor the next day. He listened to her story, his notepad filling with details. "I'll start with Michael's financials and this Greg character," he said. "Give me a week." Eleanor nodded, her heart heavy. She felt like a traitor, but she had no choice. She needed the truth, no matter how painful. As the days passed, Eleanor struggled to maintain her routine. The garden, once a source of peace, felt like a chore. Her books couldn't hold her attention. Every creak of the house made her jump, her hearing aid amplifying her anxiety. She avoided Michael's calls, unsure how to face him until she had more answers. On the 7th day, Paul called with preliminary findings. Michael's debt was real tens of thousands in credit card balances and a shady loan from an online lender. Greg, it turned out, had a history of fraud convictions, though nothing recent. "They're tied up in something," Paul said. "I'm still digging, but it's not looking good." Eleanor thanked him, her voice hollow. The truth was coming, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Eleanor's world felt like it was unraveling. The investigator's findings confirmed her worst fears. Michael was in deep trouble, and Greg was no innocent bystander. She spent sleepless nights replaying their confrontation, his half-truths echoing in her mind. She wanted to believe his debt was the root of it all, that he wasn't capable of betraying her. But doubt gnawed at her, fueled by the evidence piling up. Paul Carter called again, his voice grim. "Found something you need to see," he said. They met at a quiet cafe in town, where he slid a folder across the table. Inside were bank statements, emails, and a contract between Michael and Greg. The contract outlined a business venture, a real estate deal that promised quick profits. But the fine print mentioned leveraging family assets as collateral. Eleanor's house, her savings, her entire estate were listed as potential security. Her hands shook as she read the documents. Michael had been planning to use her inheritance to secure the deal, without her knowledge. How did he get this far? She whispered. Paul shrugged. He's been forging your signature on preliminary documents. Nothing binding yet, but he's close. Greg's the one pushing. It's got a history of roping people into bad deals. Eleanor felt sick. Her son wasn't just desperate. He was complicit. She drove home in a daze, the folder burning a hole in her passenger seat. She wanted to confront Michael again, to scream at him for his betrayal. But she knew anger wouldn't solve this. She needed a plan not just to protect her assets, but to save her son from himself. She called Margaret, who urged her to act quickly. "We'll finalize the trust," Margaret said, "and we'll file a cease and desist against Greg. He won't expect you to fight back." Eleanor spent the next day with Margaret, locking her estate into an ironclad trust. The house, the savings, the investments, everything was now protected, accessible only through strict conditions. She added a clause ensuring Michael would receive help with his debts, but only if he sought financial counseling. It was her way of offering him a lifeline. Even now, with the legal steps in place, Eleanor turned her attention to Greg. She asked Paul to keep digging, focusing on his current activities. Paul uncovered a pattern. Greg targeted vulnerable people, divorcees, retirees, anyone with assets and a weak spot. Michael, with his debts and broken marriage, was an easy mark. Eleanor's anger shifted from her son to the man exploiting him. She decided to confront Greg herself. She found him at the bar where she'd seen him with Michael. Dressed in her best coat, her silver hair neatly pinned, Eleanor walked in with a confidence she didn't feel. Greg was at the same corner booth, sipping a beer. She sat across from him, ignoring his surprised smirk. "Mrs. Grayson," he said, leaning back. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I know what you're doing," she said, her voice low but firm. "Using my son to get to my money. It stops now." Greg's smirk faded, replaced by a calculating stare. "You've got it all wrong," he said. "Michael came to me. He's the one who wants this deal." Eleanor didn't flinch. "I've got a lawyer and an investigator who say otherwise. Back off, or I'll make sure everyone in Willow Creek knows who you really are." Greg laughed, but it was nervous. "You're bluffing," he said. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "Try me." She stood and left, her heart pounding, but her resolve unbroken. She'd protected her estate. Now she had to protect her son. That night, Michael called, his voice frantic. "Mom, what did you do?" Greg's freaking out, saying the deal's off. Eleanor took a deep breath. "I know about the contract. Michael, about the forgeries. I've protected my estate, and I'm trying to protect you." There was a long silence on the other end. When he spoke, his voice cracked. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said. I needed a way out." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Come home," she said. "We'll figure this out together." He hesitated, then agreed. As she hung up, she felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be hard, but she wasn't ready to give up on her son. Not yet. Michael arrived the next morning, his face drawn and tired. Eleanor had prepared for this moment, setting out coffee and his favorite blueberry muffins. A small gesture to remind him of home, of family. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd once done homework, where George had told him stories of their youth. The familiarity seemed to soften him, his shoulders slumping as he stared into his mug. "I messed up, Mom," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to hurt you. I was drowning." Eleanor listened as he poured out the truth. The divorce had left him with nothing but debt, his job at the hardware store barely covering his bills. Greg had approached him with a promise of quick money real estate flip that sounded too good to be true. He said we could use your house as collateral, just temporarily. Michael admitted, "I thought I could pay it back before you noticed." Eleanor's heart ached, but she kept her voice steady. "You forged my signature, Michael. You went behind my back." He winced, his eyes glistening. "I know. I'm so sorry. I was desperate." And Greg kept pushing. He made it sound so easy. She wanted to reach for him, to hug him as she had when he was a boy. But she held back. Trust, once broken, wasn't easily mended. She laid out the steps she'd taken, the trust, the investigator, the confrontation with Greg. Michael's face fell with each revelation, but he didn't interrupt. When she finished, he buried his face in his hands. "I've ruined everything," he said. Eleanor shook her head. "Not everything," she said softly. "But you need to make this right. Start with Greg. Cut ties with him." Michael nodded, but she saw the fear in his eyes. Greg wasn't the type to let go easily. Eleanor decided to take matters into her own hands. She contacted Paul Carter, asking him to deliver a warning to Greg. Any further contact with Michael would result in legal action. Paul agreed, promising to make it clear that Eleanor wasn't bluffing. Over the next few days, Eleanor and Michael worked to rebuild their relationship. He moved back into the house temporarily, at her insistence, so she could keep an eye on him. They talked late into the night, unraveling years of unspoken pain. Michael admitted he'd felt like a failure, unable to live up to his father's legacy. Eleanor shared her own struggles after George's death, her fear of losing her independence. For the first time in years, they were honest with each other. But Greg wasn't done. A week later, he showed up at the house, his charm replaced by a cold edge. "You think you can scare me off," he said, standing on the porch. Eleanor faced him through the screen door, her voice calm but firm. "I don't think. Greg. I know. Leave my son alone, or you'll regret it." He smirked, but there was uncertainty in his eyes. He left without another word. Michael, watching from the hallway, looked shaken. "He won't stop, Mom," he said. "He's got too much riding on this." Eleanor nodded, her mind already working. She called Margaret, who suggested a restraining order. It was a drastic step, but Eleanor agreed. She also enrolled Michael in financial counseling, determined to help him climb out of debt the right way. As the weeks passed, Eleanor saw glimmers of the son she'd raised kind, thoughtful, capable of change. He started attending counseling sessions, took on extra shifts at the store, and began paying off his debts. Little by little, Eleanor supported him, but she didn't let her guard down. She'd learned the hard way that love couldn't blind her to reality. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Michael took her hand. "I don't deserve you, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Eleanor squeezed his hand. "You're my son," she said. "That's enough." But in her heart, she knew the journey wasn't over. Trust would take time, and forgiveness would come slowly. For now, they had a start. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of healing and vigilance. Eleanor and Michael settled into a new routine, one marked by cautious optimism. He was trying. She could see that showing up for counseling, cutting contact with Greg, even helping with small chores around the house. But Eleanor couldn't fully erase the memory of his betrayal. Every kind gesture was tinged with the question, was this genuine? Or another act? She kept in touch with Paul Carter, who reported that Greg had left Willow Creek, at least temporarily. The restraining order had done its job, but Paul warned her to stay alert. "Men like Greg don't give up easily," he said. Eleanor took his advice to heart, installing a security system and keeping her important documents in a safety deposit box. She hated feeling like a prisoner in her own home, but she refused to be caught off guard again. Michael, meanwhile, opened up about his struggles. He'd been ashamed to admit how far he'd fallen in his divorce, his financial ruin, his desperation to prove himself. "I thought if I could make that deal work, I'd be somebody again," he said one night, his voice raw. Eleanor listened, her heart torn between empathy and the sting of his choices. She encouraged him to keep going, to focus on the future. But she also set boundaries, no more secrets, no more lies. The community of Willow Creek began to notice the change in Michael. Mrs. Callahan, ever the gossip, spread word that he was turning things around. His co-workers at the hardware store commented on his renewed focus. Eleanor felt a flicker of pride, but she tempered it with caution. She'd seen how quickly trust could crumble. One afternoon, Margaret called with unexpected news. "There's a charity event in town next week," she said. "They're honoring local elders, and your name came up for your gardening work with the community center." Eleanor was surprised she donated bulbs and taught classes, but she hadn't thought it noteworthy. Margaret encouraged her to attend, suggesting it might be a chance to reconnect with the town. to reclaim her place after months of isolation. Eleanor hesitated but agreed. The event was held at the community center, a modest building decorated with fairy lights and wreaths. She wore a navy dress. Her silver hair swept into a bun, and felt a surge of confidence as neighbors greeted her warmly. Michael insisted on coming, standing by her side as she accepted a small plaque for her contributions. For the first time in months, she felt like herself again, not just a mother, not just a victim, but Eleanor Grayson, a woman with a legacy of her own. During the event, Michael pulled her aside. "I want to make things right," he said, his eyes earnest. "Not just with you, but with everyone I've let down." He told her he'd been volunteering at the community center, helping with repairs. "It's not much, but it's a start." Eleanor smiled, her heart softening. "It's a good start," she said. But the peace was short-lived. A few days later, Paul called with a warning. Greg had been seen in a neighboring town, asking questions about Eleanor's estate. "He's not done," Paul said. "He's looking for a way back in." Eleanor's stomach knotted. She'd hoped Greg was gone for good, but his persistence was unnerving. She told Michael, who looked stricken. "This is my fault," he said. "I brought him into our lives." Eleanor shook her head. "You made a mistake. Now we fix it together." She contacted Margaret, who suggested a meeting with the local sheriff to discuss Greg's actions. The sheriff, a kind man named Tom Reynolds, promised to keep an eye out. Eleanor also reached out to the bank, ensuring her accounts were monitored for suspicious activity. As winter deepened, Eleanor and Michael grew closer, their bond tempered by honesty. He shared his progress in counseling, his plans to take a financial management course. She shared her fears, her hopes, her memories of George. They were rebuilding, piece by piece, a relationship stronger than before. But Eleanor knew the shadow of Greg lingered, a reminder that their fight wasn't over. Spring arrived in Willow Creek, the tulips Eleanor had planted bursting into color. The house felt alive again, filled with the sounds of live birds outside, Michael's laughter, the hum of the radio. Eleanor's hearing remained sharp, a gift she no longer took for granted. But the threat of Greg loomed, a dark cloud on the horizon. Paul's final report came in early April. Greg had been arrested in a neighboring county for attempting to defraud another family. The news brought relief, but also a pang of sadness. Michael had been caught in Greg's web, a victim of his own desperation. Eleanor hoped his arrest would close that chapter, but she remained vigilant, checking her accounts and keeping the sheriff's number on speed dial. Michael, meanwhile, continued to rebuild his life. He'd paid off a portion of his debt, thanks to his counseling and extra work. He moved out of Eleanor's house, renting a small apartment closer to the hardware store. The distance was bittersweet, but Eleanor knew it was necessary. He needed to stand on his own, and she needed to reclaim her independence. One sunny afternoon, Michael invited her to the community center, where he'd organized a small gardening event in her honor. The turnout was modest but heartfelt: neighbors, friends, even some of Eleanor's old students. They planted a new flower bed, naming it Eleanor's Garden. Michael gave a short speech, his voice steady but emotional. "My mom taught me what strength looks like," he said, glancing at her. "She never gave up on me, even when I didn't deserve it." Eleanor's eyes welled with tears. She thought of the silence she'd endured, the betrayal she'd uncovered, the long road to this moment. She'd regained more than her hearing. She'd regained her son, her trust, her sense of purpose. The crowd applauded, and she hugged Michael tightly, feeling the weight of the past lift, just a little. That evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "I'm proud of you," Eleanor said, her voice soft. Michael smiled, his eyes bright. I'm proud of you, too, Mom. You fought for us. They sat in comfortable silence, the chirping of crickets filling the air. For the first time in months, Eleanor felt at peace. The inheritance, once a source of conflict, became a symbol of their renewal. Eleanor revised her will, keeping the trust in place but adding provisions for Michael's future small fund for education, a share of the estate when he was ready. She didn't do it out of obligation, but out of hope. Hope that he'd continue to grow, to learn, to be the man she'd always believed he could be. As the stars appeared, Eleanor reflected on her journey. Her hearing loss had been a trial, but it had led her to this momentum moment of clarity, of forgiveness, of love. She'd faced betrayal and emerged stronger, not just for herself, but for her son. The house, the garden, the life she'd built, they were hers, earned through decades of resilience. And now, they were Michael's, too. A legacy not of money, but of second chances,